AMD's technical press event bore information for both AMD Ryzen and Navi, including overclocking information for Ryzen, Navi base, boost, and average clocks, architectural information and block diagrams, product level specifications, and extreme overclocking information for Ryzen with liquid nitrogen. We understand both product lines better now than ever before and can brief you on what AMD is working on. We'll start with the Navi specs, die size, and top-level architectural information, then move on to Ryzen. AMD also talked about ray tracing during its tech day, throwing some casual shade at NVIDIA in so doing, and we'll cover that here as well. Before that, this video is brought to you by MSI's X570 motherboard lineup. MSI's X570 motherboards will be available on July 7th with the launch of Ryzen 3000 series CPUs, and now include flagship brands like Godlike, Ace, and Creation. The MSI Edge will be among the more affordable mid-range motherboards, appealing for most Ryzen 3000 builds, while the Godlike has more overclocking support, an abundance of LEDs, an OLED, and a server-grade PCB for improved PCIe 4 signal integrity. Keep an eye out for MSI's X570 motherboards for the Ryzen 3000 launch, or learn more at the link in the description below. So first off, note that AMD did not give pricing information to us today, and that instead will be unveiled at the E3 event, which will be happening or will have happened right around when this video goes live. So we'll do our best to post a comment and pin it to the top with the prices once AMD does unveil them. But if we don't do it, please post the prices below so that everyone can see them and get that information. We do have a whole lot of other stuff though, including a ton of architectural information. And this event overall yielded a lot in terms of details on deeper down specs for the products. Some of it we're saving for later because there's too much of it to go through all here, but we do have most of it for this. I want to get one gripe out of the way first. There's these tech days, they're primarily actual good tech information, but there's a little bit of marketing screwery in this one, and that was with trying to show a comparison of CPU thermals between two different CPUs by pointing a thermal camera at a heatsink. And there's a lot of problems with that. One of them, the scale on that image was 23 to 27 degrees, if I remember correctly, which is insane for a scale because then you have white hot and red as a 0.2 degree difference. And separately, pointing a thermal camera at a shiny metal heatsink doesn't do anything. It doesn't tell us what the junction temperature is. In fact, you want the heatsink to be hot because that means it's working. And also, you're probably showing the reflected temperature of the room or the environment, not the temperature of the device itself. Or maybe you could deal with emissivity issues as well. You really need like a black body object for that, for measurement, and then ideally a scale that's not 4 degrees wide. Just for reference, what we would like to see here is an actual junction measurement where you're looking at the internal processor sensor for thermals, or you're at least putting like a thermocouple in there between the heatsink and the IHS, something like that. Anything but pointing a thermal camera at a heatsink. That's actually useless. So that was the only real gripe. And for that to be the only major gripe coming from us is pretty damn good. So just kind of set the stage with that. I mean, that's the main thing that we have to complain about. And you know our content. If that's the main thing to complain about, then that's not so bad. Let's get into the GPU specs, frequency, and die size first, and then we'll walk through the Ryzen parts after that. AMD has two GPUs it plans to release in July of 2019 with the exact date TBD at time of filming. Ryzen 3000 mostly lands on July 7th, so the GPUs will push out around the same time. The APUs will also launch on July 7th with the CPUs. The two cards will be the RX 5700 XT and RX 5700 non-XT, both moving away from GCN and towards the new RDNA architecture. We've known GCN to be extremely limited in cache bandwidth and in scalability past 56 CUs, so RDNA will be a refreshing change that should be interesting to study. GCN will stay alive for now for the high-performance deep learning and non-gaming market segments, but RDNA will be the gaming architecture going forward. The RX 5700 XT will host 40 compute units with 64 stream processors per CU, or 2560 stream processors for the 40 CU RX 5700 XT. This is the same SP per CU count as Vega 10, also at 64 stream processors per CU. But note that you can't linearly compare these streaming processors one-to-one because the architecture has changed a lot. In an AMD performance demo, the company showed the press that its Navi 10 GPU, that's the one being used in the 5700 series, posts about 14% higher performance versus Vega 64 with about 23% lower power consumption. This was an AMD internal demo, so obviously we need need to validate that at home base, but that uplift is promising for RDNA's significantly smaller first GPU. Speeds were listed to media as 1905 MHz boost, 1755 MHz for gaming workloads, and 1605 MHz base, where boost here really just means the peak clock or the rare opportunistic clock. The delta between boost and gaming tells us a few things, but one of them is that AMD's chosen blower cooler is potentially a poor choice once again, to no one's surprise. There should be more thermal and power headroom there to clock higher, and we think that'll be proven once their custom design's out or when we put a water block on the card. We'll talk about the negatives more later, but let's get back to the specs and the architecture notes first. As for GPU size, AMD also provided that information to the press. The Vega 64 die, for reference, measures at 495 millimeters squared, with Navi 10 measuring at 251 millimeters squared. This is extremely important, and it's for a lot of reasons. By significantly cutting the die size and also by eliminating the highly expensive HBM2, AMD is able to cut its manufacturing costs significantly and finally start competing with NVIDIA directly in price. AMD claims that the RX 5700 XT will be the direct RTX 2070 competitor. We don't have the price while filming this, but we'll make sure it's posted below as noted earlier and fill it in for us if you can. Either way, we know for a fact that Navi 10 will be a lot cheaper for AMD to make than Vega because the die is smaller and there's no HBM2, instead moving to GDDR6. So these are good things. This means the price will come down for the consumer as well, in theory anyway. And if AMD's claimed increase of performance per watt and reduction in power consumption are even remotely true, which they really should be, there's no reason they wouldn't be, then this could be AMD's proper re-entry into the gaming market. For the past couple of years, we've basically gotten refreshes of refreshes, which is extremely boring for everyone. You have an RX 580 refreshing to 480, and RX 590 refreshing a 580, and obviously didn't do a whole lot to gain AMD any ground other than compete kind of with the 1060 class hardware. So AMD is still not competing at flagship level. We would really like to see that, if only for the halo marketing effect. That's an important class. Even if a lot of people aren't buying 2080 Ti's, for example, it's a marketing move where the halo effect of having the best product on the market, and that's really what it is in the gaming world, even if it's not the best value, because it isn't, the value of having the best product on the charts is that people will look at that and then they'll think, I want that, but I can't afford it. They'll buy the next tier down. So AMD really does need to get a flagship out there at some point, but they're starting with a 40 CU part that will compete with an RTX 2070, and that is a really popular market segment, so it's not a bad move. It's just one that we've seen repeated time and time again by AMD. This time, however, it does look like, on paper, that the specs are more competitive than the previous attempts at competing in this price category. So that's the hope, that we see some renewed competition with a new architecture that is promising, but we do really want to see something in the flagship territory at some point. It's not going to be this time, at least not this launch, but maybe this architecture later down the line. In short, the 5700 XT has 40 CUs, 8 gigabytes of GDDR6 at 14 gigabits per second for 48 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, 1755 megahertz gaming frequencies, 1905 megahertz boost, likely limited by the blower cooler, and we'll have to see what better solutions can do later. The RX 5700 non-XT will cut down to 36 CUs, 2304 stream processors with an 8 gigabyte GDDR6 frame buffer and GPU speeds of 1725 megahertz boost, 1625 megahertz gaming, and 1465 megahertz base. AMD was forced to acknowledge the real-time ray tracing marketing battle this time, but doesn't have an immediate plan to support it. From our end, we think it's fine that there's no immediate support for real-time ray tracing. It's just that the market demand for real-time ray tracing is it's sort of hard to gauge. So we know that there's not a whole lot of support for RTX when NVIDIA launched with it. No games supported it, for one. And so it's interesting to see the script flip a bit between everyone saying RTX has no value to now people are saying, well, but it doesn't have RTX. And that's something you'll see more in our discussion with Gordon from PC World in a separate video. But to give credit to NVIDIA, they have forced AMD to acknowledge ray tracing and start talking about it. And AMD's way of doing this was mostly to say, well, we'll push the features and the hardware when the two are ready to be shipped together. So throwing a little bit of shade at NVIDIA for that, and they talked about, quote, driving the ecosystem so that gamers can take full advantage of the features they pay for, which is a fair comment to make and a bit of a jab. But as a quick aside, and a separate one, note that AMD is planning on making a 7nm plus Navi GPU for late 2020 or 2021, and that's aiming to support some form of maybe hybrid ray tracing in the future. We don't have exact details, but AMD did note an interest in moving to support parts of ray tracing with full ray tracing support more targeted for cloud computing later, indicating that this is not something AMD expects to be doing locally anytime soon, and that's probably realistic. The industry isn't quite ready for it yet, as we've seen with RTX. Total board power should be 225 watts for the 5700 XT, 180 watts for the 5700 non-XT. We asked if vBIOS would be locked, and due to security concerns, AMD is locking down custom vBIOS modifications. We then asked if power play table hacks would work this generation, and we were told with a laugh that we'd have to learn new tricks to bypass the power limits. That's a little bit of a letdown from the fringe use case of power modding, but we're hopeful that we, or more likely Buildzoid, can find new power bypasses. The reference card will be using a blower design. There are two different shroud designs that we've seen, but the PCB is overall mostly the same with one change to the VRM. So reference cooler is a blower cooler. Unfortunately, it has a vapor chamber. This is a design we've seen struggle 100% of the time in the past. AMD is adamant that this is the way they want to go with it, primarily for reasons of using it in poor ventilation cases, which we've done that test, and a lot of the time the dual axial cards do still work better because you're sucking all the heat from the whole system through the GPU otherwise. But either way, AMD has made some moves in the right direction by restricting the noise this time. So the RPM ranges from a couple hundred RPM at the low end when it's idle to about 1800 RPM or so max when it's under load, and that will vary depending on how cool the ambient case temperature is. But AMD says it's limiting the noise level to 43 dBA. Now, a quick note, that doesn't actually mean anything right now because we don't know the distance that number is measured at. So 43 dBA without the comparative of their measurement for the original coolers really doesn't mean anything to us presently, but it's not because they were trying to hide it, it's just because they didn't know, and they have to go find the answer for that, and we won't have it before we film. So what we do know is that AMD said their measurements more or less matched ours, and for what that's worth, we found that the previous blower designs ranked about 59 dBA under 100% load, and so if AMD's capping at 43 this time, that is a significant reduction in noise. Remember that this is not a linear scale, it's a logarithmic one, so that difference means a lot more than the linear delta would be. So that's potentially a good thing, but we need to test the card to see more. The reference 5700 XT PCB will have a 7-phase VRM. We don't know the power stages. Unfortunately, we did ask, but not something they had for us today. It's probably a 6+1 configuration, but AMD couldn't confirm that for us today. Again, they're not hiding it. It's just a matter of getting information quickly enough. And then the 5700 non-XT is going to have one fewer phase. That'll probably be a 5+1. Power stages we need to follow up on and get full information on that for the analysis of how much power the PCB can handle. We also, for what it's worth, didn't see a vBIOS switch on the card, so it looks like a single BIOS this time. It should be a pretty final retail version of the card that we saw, but there might be one more revision of changes, so maybe. We won't commit to a firm statement, but it does look like probably single BIOS on that card. Before diving any deeper on the GPU stuff, let's talk CPUs for a bit. This was a very complex and long tech day. There's a ton of information we won't be publishing here today. On the CPU side of things, AMD did have an XOC LN2 demo at the event, and we learned that AMD was hitting about 5.35 gigahertz all-core on the 16-core CPU, which until now was not officially shown. And this was using an MSI Godlike motherboard, something for which we have some initial coverage from Computex, and Buildzoid will have a full PCB breakdown on his channel. But Godlike board is about top tier for MSI for XOC, and this matches the numbers we mostly heard previously. We've also heard 12 core, this is from a board partner, should do 5.5 plus, approaching 6 gigahertz on LN2. So 16 core at 5.35 gigahertz with LN2 does make sense. We don't have H2O numbers just yet, unfortunately, but we are trying to get them. And as for the rest, there are a couple of critical notes for overclockers that you may be happy to hear. If you do benching, then PCIe Gen 1 no longer has to be used for Ryzen for the actual 3D benchmark, or for benchmarking in general. So now you can do 3D benching with Ryzen and enable PCIe Gen 3 or 4. Previously, you had to disable those and go down to Gen 1 in order to run the benchmarks properly. Cold bugs will depend per CPU, but the one that was being run for AMD's demo was run at about minus 150 degrees Celsius for the LN2 XOC demo. For memory overclocking, Ryzen 3000 is also looking more promising than previously. It's supposed to fairly easily support 3600 megahertz XMP without issue. And then we've also heard on MSI's boards of going upwards of 5100 megahertz for the memory at timings of 18, 21, 21, 56, and 1T for the command rate. That 5100 megahertz overclock was done without LN2 on the CPU. So that's just a memory overclock. That's a result of better trace layout and a result of a new controller design. Some of the more noteworthy architectural changes to Ryzen 3000 CPUs focus on higher IPC and higher gaming performance. Interestingly, in AMD's engineering discussion, the senior architects and AMD fellows thought that Zen2 would see frequencies regressing, which is something that you do typically see with a process reduction, for example, down to 7 nanometers for this one. Engineers originally thought the jump to 7 nanometers would result in lower clocks, relegating Zen2 to a server part, but it's actually coming out to desktop clients. So that's quite the change from what it was going to be otherwise. The team was able to figure it out, and some of the key changes include the following. AMD doubled the size of floating point engine to 256 bits, meaning that AVX 256 can now run a single cycle on Zen2, so that's a big change. AMD has doubled its load store bandwidth for data storage and movement. Integer execution was also improved, primarily by reducing resource contention during integer operations. AMD also doubled the L3 cache size. More data in local cache should mean fewer hits to memory, but also reduced effective latency to system memory. AMD further highlighted that this improvement in the cache access and in prefetching algorithms should reduce the effective memory latency. And as an aside, AMD has made the decision, unfortunately, to rebrand L3 as Game Cache. So if you see that name in the future, that's what that means. That is what L3 is now. AMD showed some more internal benchmark charts, and while we know there's an improvement to gaming, of course, we'd advise looking out for our own benchmark testing when the processor's launch. Some of the internal charts looked a bit GPU constrained, depending on which one you look at, but we do anticipate performance uplift, if only from the IPC increase and, of course, from the frequency increase. So these are places where you will see performance increase, especially in games versus the previous generations. Memory is also more easily tuned to 3600 megahertz, as noted earlier, and beyond to 5000 with the MSI setup that was used for memory extreme overclocking, probably by top PC. AMD also walked through architectural changes that we'll speak to in more depth approaching the launch. For some quick stats, we learned that AMD has moved its integer execution to a 92 entry integer scheduler from 84 previously. It has increased physical register file entries from 168 to 180. It has grown the reorder buffer from 192 to 224, which is meant to help with making up for the latency hit by increasing L3 size. And AMD has increased the store queue from 44 to 48 with increased load store bandwidth by 2x. And that should recap us for now. So again, there's a lot more. We have several documents on all the breakout sessions. There's a lot to learn here, and we'll try to cover that over the next week or weeks as we approach the launch. But for the pricing, we don't have it at time of recording. Leave it below, or we'll do it if we catch it in time. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus or store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly. We'll see you all next time.